The sound of the 13th bell toll is something I will carry with me to my grave, and I fear that grave is not far off. It wasn't the deep, resonant chime that echoed across the valley, the one we all knew and had heard countless times. It was a cracked, mournful sound, a note of pure finality that sliced through the cold autumn air and settled deep in our bones, like a shard of ice against the heart. Then came the thud, a heavy, sickening sound from the base of the old church tower. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. A sound that marked the end of a life, the end of a tradition, and the beginning of my own personal nightmare. This is a new channel with incredible stories every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. My name is Arthur Penhaligon, and for the last 50 of those years, I've owned the Dusty Page, our little town's only bookstore. It's less of a business and more of a sanctuary, a quiet place filled with the smell of aging paper, leather bindings, and forgotten stories. I've lived in Havenwood my whole life. I've seen children born, grow old, and pass on. I've seen seasons change, and the world outside our valley twist and turn into something barely recognizable. But here in Havenwood, things remained constant. Our cornerstone, the very heart of our identity, was our oldest tradition, the ringing of souls. Every year, on the last Sunday of October, as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, the oldest living resident of Havenwood would climb the steep, winding steps of St. Giles's church tower. They would grasp the thick, frayed rope of the ancient bell and ring it once for every soul our town had lost that year. It was a somber, beautiful ceremony. We'd gather in the square below, heads bowed, scarves pulled tight against the chill, listening as each toll honored a friend, a neighbor, a family member. It was our way of saying goodbye, of ensuring they were never forgotten. The bell, we believed, sent their names echoing into eternity, a final, peaceful farewell. This year, the duty fell to Elias Vance. Elias was 94, a man who seemed carved from the same ancient oak as the church pews. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, his back bent, but his eyes were as clear and sharp as the winter sky. He'd been the town's clockmaker, a man who understood the steady, unforgiving march of time better than anyone. We all knew this would be his last ringing. His health was failing, and he spoke often of joining his beloved wife, Mary, who we'd lost in the spring. There was a poetic finality to it that we all understood and respected. He would ring for Mary, and then he would be at peace. The town registry, which I kept updated with the vicar, listed 12 souls who had departed since the last ringing. 12 names. 12 tolls. We were all gathered in the square, watching the small arched window of the bell tower, waiting for Elias to begin. The first bell rang out, clear and strong, for old Mrs. Gable from the bakery. The second for young Timothy, taken by a fever. The third for Mary Vance, Elias's own wife. We counted along silently, each toll a painful memory, a shared loss. 4, 5, 6. Each one a perfect, heart-wrenching note. 7, 8, 9. The sound washing over us, a tide of grief and remembrance. 10. For the Henderson boy who'd crashed his car on the slick mountain road. 11. For my dear friend Robert, who'd sat in the same chair in my bookstore every Tuesday for 30 years. And finally, 12. For a baby born too soon. A heavy silence fell over the square. We waited. We expected the silence to hold, for the ceremony to be over. But then it came. The 13th toll. It was wrong. The sound was dissonant, a horrible, cracked groan from the ancient bronze, as if the bell itself was in agony. A murmur went through the crowd. Who was the 13th? Was there a mistake? Did someone pass in the last hour that we didn't know about? And then, cutting through our confusion, that terrible final thud. It wasn't a crash. It was a dull, soft impact, the sound of something heavy and fragile hitting the damp earth. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. People started running towards the churchyard. I felt my own old heart hammer against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My legs, stiff and unreliable, carried me forward as fast as they could. I pushed through the growing crowd and saw him. Elias Vance, lying at the base of the tower, his body twisted at an unnatural angle on the fallen leaves. His eyes were open, staring up at the bell that had just rung its last, awful note. The next few hours were a blur of flashing blue lights and the hushed, professional tones of paramedics and the police. Sheriff Brody, a man I'd known since he was a boy who used to steal candy from the general store, looked grim. He took me aside, knowing I was a close friend of Elias. "Looks like he lost his footing, Arthur," Brody said, his voice low. "The stairs in that tower are treacherous. It's a tragedy, a terrible, terrible accident." An accident. It was the easy answer, the one that would let the town sleep at night. But I couldn't accept it. Two things gnawed at me. Two discordant notes in the symphony of this tragedy. First, the 13th bell. There were only 12 names in the registry. I knew this for a fact. I had written them down myself. So who was the 13th toll for? And second, if Elias fell from the stairs inside the tower, who rang the bell? He couldn't have rung it and fallen from the top at the same time. The timing was impossible. The next day, a somber quiet hung over Havenwood. The autumn leaves seemed to fall with a sorrowful hush. My bookstore felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. People came in, not to buy books but to talk, to whisper their theories. Some said Elias, in his grief and confusion, had miscounted. Others whispered that the 13th toll was a bad omen, a curse upon the town. Young Thomas Croft, the ambitious new head of the town council and the vicar's son, made a public statement calling for the end of the archaic and dangerous tradition. He spoke of safety regulations and the town's liability. His words were practical, sensible, but they felt cold, disrespectful. He was eager to pave over our history, to replace it with something sterile and new. I disliked him instantly. He saw our traditions not as the soul of our community but as a problem to be solved. That evening, unable to rest, I went to the church. The tower door was now locked, a strip of yellow police tape across it. I found Vicar Croft in his study, a weary-looking man drowning in a sea of paperwork. "Arthur," he sighed, rubbing his eyes, "a terrible business." I asked him about the 13th toll. "Grief can play tricks on the mind," he offered, echoing the common sentiment. Elias was old. He was mourning Mary. Perhaps he lost track. It was a plausible explanation, but it didn't feel true. It didn't fit the man I knew. Elias was a clockmaker. Precision was in his blood. He wouldn't miscount. He just wouldn't. I asked the vicar if I could see Elias's personal effects, anything he had on him. Reluctantly, he agreed, leading me to a small office where a cardboard box sat on a desk. Inside was Elias's worn wallet, his keys, a handkerchief, and a small, leather-bound notebook. I took the notebook back to my shop, the bell in my mind still ringing that discordant 13th note. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one my wife always said had molded to the shape of my worries, and opened it. Most of it was just daily observations, notes on clock repairs, thoughts about the weather, memories of Mary. But on the very last page, written in a shaky, frail hand, was a list of 12 names. Our 12 souls. He had not miscounted. And underneath the last name, a single, chilling sentence. "One more for the one they forgot. God forgive me. The one they forgot." My blood ran cold. This was no accident. This was intentional. Elias had known exactly what he was doing. But who was this forgotten soul? And why did ringing a bell for them require God's forgiveness? My quiet life as a bookseller was over. I was now an investigator, an old man armed with nothing but a cryptic clue and a lifetime of knowing the people of my town and their secrets. I knew the town archives, housed in the basement of the library, were my only hope. The next day I delved into decades of records, my fingers coated in the fine gray dust of the past. I searched birth and death certificates, town meeting minutes, old newspapers. I was looking for a ghost, a person whose existence had been erased. For days, I found nothing. The town's history seemed complete, every life accounted for. I felt a creeping sense of foolishness. Maybe I was just an old man chasing shadows, refusing to accept the simple tragic truth of an accident. I was on the verge of giving up, my back aching and my eyes sore from deciphering faded ink. I felt trapped. I had a secret that felt like a hot coal in my hand. Going to Sheriff Brody with a cryptic line from a dead man's journal felt like a fool's errand. He'd pat me on the shoulder and tell me to go home and get some rest. Confronting Thomas Croft or his father, the vicar, seemed equally pointless. They were invested in moving on, in burying the past, not digging it up. I was alone with this puzzle. And honestly, what would you have done in my place? Would you have trusted the authorities with a half-baked theory? Or would you have kept digging, even if it meant disturbing things best left buried? Let me know in the comments. I decided to keep digging. My search led me to the year 1958. I was just a young man then, recently married, dreaming of opening my bookstore. I was looking through the town council records for that year when I saw it. A series of meetings about an incident at the church. There were no details, just vague references to a structural review of the bell tower and a private fund established for the Blackwood family. The Blackwoods. The name was a faint echo in my memory. They had left Havenwood suddenly around that time. No one ever knew why. I cross-referenced the name with the town's birth records. There it was, Lily Blackwood, born 1952. But there was no death certificate, no record of her ever leaving. She had simply vanished from the records. I felt a jolt, a connection forming across the decades, a forgotten soul. I had to find out what happened to Lily Blackwood. My search took me to the oldest residents of Havenwood, the few who were around in 1958 and might remember. Most of them had hazy memories, their minds clouded by time. But then I spoke to Martha, Elias's younger sister, who lived in the nursing home at the edge of town. Her memory was a patchwork, but when I mentioned the name Blackwood, her eyes cleared for a moment. "Oh, the Blackwoods," she whispered, her voice like rustling leaves. "That poor family. After the little girl, Lily had her accident." "Accident? What accident, Martha?" I pressed gently. "The bell," she said, her gaze turning distant. "She was always playing near the church. They said she climbed the tower. The old rope, it snapped. They never found." Her voice trailed off, and the fog returned to her eyes. The old rope snapped. They never found her. My God! The pieces began to fall into place with a horrifying clarity. A little girl, a broken rope, a family that disappeared, and a town that buried a secret so deep it was almost forgotten. Elias would have been a young man then, in his 30s. He was already helping maintain the church. Even before he became the official clockmaker, he would have known about the rope. He would have been there. The 13th toll wasn't for someone who had died this year. It was for a little girl who had died 60 years ago, whose death was never officially recorded, whose soul was never given its farewell. The guilt must have eaten away at Elias his entire life, a debt unpaid, and his final act on this earth was to pay it. Armed with this terrible new knowledge, I felt a surge of righteous anger. The town's leaders, the vicar's father before him, they had covered this up. They had erased a child's life to avoid a scandal. I thought of confronting Thomas Croft, of exposing the whole rotten history. But then, I thought of Elias. This wasn't about revenge. It was about honoring his final wish. I still had one question, though, the most important one. If Elias had fallen, who had completed the ringing? Who had pulled the rope that 13th, terrible time? There was only one person I could think of who was as devoted to Elias as he was to his own past. His daughter, Eleanor. A quiet, sad woman who worked as a nurse and had cared for her father tirelessly in his final years. I found her at his cottage, packing his belongings into boxes. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. I didn't know how to begin, so I simply told her what I had found. I told her about Lily Blackwood, the broken rope, and the line in her father's journal. She didn't act surprised. She just sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping in defeat, and began to weep. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "He couldn't let it go," she said. "He told me the story a few weeks ago. He said he was the one who was supposed to inspect the rope that week. He was busy, he forgot. He carried that guilt his whole life. He believed Lily's soul was trapped, unable to rest, because she never had her bell rung. My heart ached for her, for the impossible weight she was carrying. He made me promise," she continued, looking at me with pleading eyes. "He knew he was too weak. He knew he didn't have the strength to climb those stairs and ring the bell 12 times, let alone 13. He knew this would be his last act." The story came tumbling out. Elias had a plan. He would ring the bells, and Eleanor would be waiting in the belfry with him. He managed the first 12 tolls on pure adrenaline and willpower. But after the 12th he collapsed, his strength gone. He looked at her, his eyes begging. "For Lily," he had whispered. "Ring it for the forgotten one." So Eleanor, her hands shaking, her heart breaking, took the rope and pulled. She rang the 13th bell. As the cracked, mournful sound echoed across the valley, her father smiled, a look of profound peace on his face. He whispered, "Thank you." And then, with the last of his energy, he pushed himself towards the open archway of the bell tower. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't an accident. It was an end he had chosen. The truth was so much more complex and heartbreaking than I could have imagined. It wasn't a murder or a curse, but a desperate act of love and atonement. A daughter honoring her father's final, agonizing wish. A man trying to quiet a ghost that had haunted him for 60 years. Eleanor looked at me, her face streaked with tears. "You're going to tell the sheriff, aren't you?" she asked, her voice hollow. And this was my final, terrible choice. To reveal the truth would be to send this grieving woman to prison. It would be to dig up a 60-year-old tragedy and smear the names of Havenwood's founding families. It would turn Elias's final act of peace into a sordid public scandal. Or I could let it lie. I could let the official stories stand. A tragic accident. I could let Elias be remembered as the faithful keeper of tradition, not a man who ended his own life. I could let Lily Blackwood's soul, finally acknowledged, rest in peace, her secret kept safe by the few who now knew. If you've been on this journey with me and felt the weight of this story as I have, please consider subscribing. There are more stories hidden in the quiet corners of the world, and I want to share them with you. In the end, I made my choice. I looked at Eleanor, this woman shattered by grief and loyalty, and I saw not a criminal, but a daughter who had loved her father too much. I saw the end of a long and painful story, not the beginning of a new one. I reached out and put my hand on her shoulder. "There's nothing to tell, Eleanor," I said softly. "Your father was a good man who upheld our town's most sacred tradition to his very last breath. That is how he will be remembered." A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over her face. I walked out of that cottage and left the secret behind me, buried with Elias and Lily. The town council, led by the ever-efficient Thomas Croft, officially ended the Ringing of Souls ceremony, citing safety concerns. The old bell in St. Giles's Tower is now silent. Some of the younger folk were relieved. The older ones, like me, feel its silence as a kind of emptiness, a missing note in the song of our town. I never told anyone the full story. I carry it with me, another volume in the vast library of secrets a man accumulates over a long life. Sometimes, late at night in my quiet bookstore, I think I can hear it. A faint, cracked, 13th toll on the wind. A final goodbye for the forgotten, and a reminder that the deepest truths are often the ones that are never spoken aloud. What do you think? Did I do the right thing by protecting Eleanor and her father's secret? Or does the truth deserve to be known no matter the cost? Share your thoughts or theories in the comments. I read all of them.